The mineral rights underlying this entire development are the sovereign property of the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association, and your unauthorized claim constitutes a cloud on the title of every homeowner herein. That was the sentence that started the war. It was printed on thick, creamy cardstock, the kind of paper people use for wedding invitations, not declarations of hostility. The letterhead was an embossed monstrosity of swooping cursive and a poorly drawn willow tree. It felt less like a legal notice and more like a passive-aggressive welcome basket. I was a geologist, a materials engineer to be more precise. My world was one of crystalline structures, stress tensors, and the cold, hard logic of physics. I dealt with facts, with things you could measure, test, and break. This letter, however, was a creature of pure fiction. It was an assertion built on nothing more than the audacity of its author, a woman I would come to know as Carol. I had moved to Serenity Meadows 6 months prior. It was supposed to be an epilogue, a quiet place to buffer the silence that had filled my life after my wife, Eleanor, passed away. The house wasn't just a house, it was a legacy. It was built by my great-grandfather on land his family had owned since the territory was still wrestling with statehood. He'd been a pragmatic man who held onto the subsurface rights when he sold off the surrounding acreage for development in the late 70s. He always said, "Never sell the ground beneath your feet." The deed was ironclad. I'd reviewed it myself, and Southwest had the estate lawyer. The language was as clear as a flawless quartz crystal, all rights, titles, and interests in all minerals, including but not limited to oil, gas, and other hydrocarbons, and all other ores and mineral substances of any nature whatsoever. My family owned everything from the grass down to the planet's molten core. The HOA, a relatively recent invention from the 90s, had no more claim to my mineral rights than they did to the moon. I suppose I should have seen the storm clouds gathering. Serenity Meadows was one of those communities that looked peaceful from a distance, but up close, you could see the tension lines. The lawns were unnaturally green, the mailboxes were unnervingly uniform, and an invisible network of judgment seemed to hum in the air like high-voltage power lines. My introduction to the source of that voltage came a week after I moved in. A woman with a helmet of blonde hair, shellacked into immobility, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy text, had marched up my driveway. "I'm Carol," she'd announced, her voice carrying the clipped, authoritative tone of someone who had never been told no, president of the association. I introduced myself. She wasn't interested. Her eyes scanned my property, cataloging infractions. "Your recycling bin is visible from the street," she said, making a sharp tick on her clipboard. "It must be stored out of sight, per bylaw 74. You have 48 hours to comply. Welcome to the neighborhood." She turned and marched away before I could even respond. That was Carol. She wasn't a person, she was a walking, talking set of bylaws. So, when the letter about the mineral rights arrived, I wasn't entirely surprised by the sheer nerve. I was, however, annoyed. It was a distraction, a pointless bit of bureaucratic saber-rattling that I had no time for. My work was demanding. I had a contract with a subsidiary that supplied the Pentagon. I analyzed and sourced strategic minerals, the rare earth elements that made everything from guidance systems to stealth coatings possible. My days were spent staring into electron microscopes, not arguing with suburban despots. My first response was measured and professional. I was a man who believed in process, in documentation. I wrote a polite, concise letter back to the HOA board. I enclosed a certified copy of my deed, with the relevant sections highlighted. I cited the state property laws that affirmed my ownership. I explained that the HOA's claim was legally baseless. I ended it by stating that I considered the matter closed. I was naive. I thought I was dealing with a rational entity. I thought logic would prevail. I had mistaken a rabid animal for a reasonable human being. A week later, the first fine arrived. $100. The violation. Unapproved landscaping. I looked out at my yard. It was the same yard that had been there for a month, the same one that had passed the initial move-in inspection. I walked the perimeter, looking for the offending plant, the rogue garden gnome. I found nothing. I called the HOA management company. The bored-sounding woman on the other end of the line pulled up my file. "Ah, yes," she said. "It's for the rosebush." "The rosebush?" I asked, looking at the beautiful, deep red blooms by my front porch. That rosebush was planted by my grandmother 30 years ago. It's not on the approved list of flora for your zone, she chirped, devoid of any human emotion. You can find the list on the community portal. The fine is due in 15 days. This was her opening salvo. Carol wasn't just going to drop the mineral rights issue, she was going to make my life so miserable that I'd either give in or pack up and leave. She had declared war not with a cannon but with 1,000 paper cuts. The fines kept coming. My grass was a quarter-inch too high. A small, almost invisible crack in the driveway concrete, which had been there since the Clinton administration, was suddenly a structural hazard. My garbage cans were put out 2 hours too early. Each notice was a little jab, a reminder that she was watching, that she had the power to needle me to death. She escalated to the neighborhood Facebook group. She never used my name directly, but her posts were masterpieces of insinuation. Just a reminder to all residents, one began, that our community covenants are what keep our property values high. We must all be vigilant against those who would put their own selfish interests ahead of the collective good, whether it's by ignoring landscaping rules or by making outlandish claims on resources that belong to all of us. The comments section was a chorus of her sycophants. You tell Carol. So glad we have you to protect our neighborhood. I was being painted as a villain, a greedy outsider trying to ruin their suburban paradise. The irony was suffocating. I wanted nothing more than to be left alone in the house where I'd spent summers as a child, the house where Eleanor and I had dreamed of retiring. The anger started as a slow burn, a low-grade heat in my chest. I was a patient man. My work required it. You can't rush crystal formation, you can't hurry radioactive decay. But Carol was testing the limits of that patience. She was methodically dismantling the peace I had come here to find. I consulted an attorney, a dry but competent man who specialized in property law. He confirmed what I already knew. Her claim is laughable, he said, peering at my deed over his spectacles. It wouldn't survive a single motion to dismiss. The fines are harassment, plain and simple. He advised me to pay the fines under protest to avoid liens, and then sue the HOA to recover the costs and get an injunction. It was the sensible, legal path. It was the path of reason. But I was beginning to realize that reason was a language Carol did not speak. The turning point, the moment the slow burn in my chest erupted into a cold, clear flame of resolve, came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was the anniversary of the day I met Eleanor. I had spent the morning in the small memorial garden I had built for her in the backyard. It wasn't much, a simple stone bench, some of her favorite flowers, and a small Japanese maple tree. It was my sanctuary. When I came home from work that evening, there was a new notice stuck to my door, flapping in the breeze. It was bright orange. Final notice of violation, unapproved structural and landscape modification. It cited the garden. The bench was an unauthorized permanent structure, the flower beds were an unapproved alteration of the landscape gradient, the Japanese maple was, of course, not on the approved flora list. The notice concluded, corrective action, consisting of the complete removal of all non-compliant elements, must be taken within 7 days. Failure to comply will result in the association hiring a contractor to perform the removal at the homeowner's expense. They were going to tear out my wife's memorial. I stood there on my porch, the orange paper crinkling in my clenched fist. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the unnaturally perfect lawns of Serenity Meadows. The quiet I had sought here suddenly felt menacing, like the silence before an earthquake. In my line of work, I studied breaking points. Every material has one. You apply stress, you increase the load, and you watch. The material will bend, it will deform, but for a while, it holds. Then, in an instant, a microscopic crack forms and propagates, and the entire structure fails catastrophically. Carol had just applied the final ounce of pressure. She had pushed me past my elastic limit. Something inside me fractured. The patient, peace-seeking man who had written polite letters and consulted attorneys was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone colder and far more methodical. This was no longer about a stupid legal dispute. It wasn't about fines or rosebushes. It was about a fundamental principle. A person's home is their fortress. My home was a fortress of memory, and she was threatening to tear down its most sacred wall. I went inside and sat down at my desk. I pulled out a fresh legal pad. This was no longer a problem for a lawyer to solve with motions and injunctions. This was a project. My project. And like any project I undertook, it would begin with a thorough analysis of the materials. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to dismantle her. I was going to take apart her little empire, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but dust. The first phase of any project is data acquisition. I needed to know everything about Carol, the HOA board, and the history of Serenity Meadows. I was trained to find what was hidden beneath the surface, and I would apply that same skill set to this problem. She wanted to fight over what was underground. Fine. We'd start there. But I wouldn't be looking for minerals. I'd be looking for dirt. I began with public records, the foundation of any good investigation. I spent a weekend digging through county clerk databases, pulling every document related to the Serenity Meadows HOA. Articles of incorporation, bylaws, amendments, meeting minutes, liens, lawsuits. It was a mountain of tedious digital paperwork, but I was methodical. I organized it all into a chronological database on my secure server. Patterns began to emerge. Carol had been president for 6 years. In that time, the HOA's legal fees had tripled. The number of fines issued had increased by 500%. They were bleeding the homeowners dry with petty infractions, and the money seemed to be flowing into a few specific vendor accounts, including a landscaping company and a general repair contractor. I cross-referenced the names of those companies with state business filings. The landscaping company, Verdant Visions, was owned by Carol's brother-in-law. The repair contractor, Solid Solutions LLC, was a shell corporation with a registered agent who shared a mailing address with Carol's husband, a man named Tom. It was sloppy. Arrogant. She was treating the HOA's coffers like her personal piggy bank. It was a start, but it wasn't a silver bullet. Kickbacks were hard to prove without an insider. Next, I focused on Carol herself. Property records, tax assessments, political donations. She and Tom lived in one of the largest houses in the development, a McMansion at the end of the main cul-de-sac. Their lifestyle seemed aspirational. New cars every couple of years, lavish vacation photos on her public social media profiles. It seemed like a lot to float on Tom's salary as a mid-level insurance salesman and the unpaid glory of being HOA president. The most interesting thread I found was a series of quitclaim deeds. Over the past 4 years, a single entity, Meadowlark Holdings LLC, had purchased 3 properties within the HOA that had gone into foreclosure. They bought them at auction for pennies on the dollar. The registered agent for Meadowlark Holdings was, once again, the same person listed for Tom's repair company. Carol was using the HOA's aggressive fining and lien process to force vulnerable residents into foreclosure, then snapping up their properties through a proxy company. It was a predatory, deeply unethical scheme. But was it illegal? Maybe. It depended on the specifics of the auctions and whether she used her insider knowledge as HOA president to her advantage. It was more dirt, but still not the seismic event I needed to bring her down. I needed to get closer. I needed eyes and ears. I started by talking to my next-door neighbor, Frank. Frank was a retired Army JAG officer, a man who radiated a quiet competence and spent most of his days meticulously tending his garden. He'd given me a polite nod most mornings, but we'd never really talked. I caught him by the fence one Saturday. I kept it casual, complaining about the latest fine for my driveway crack. Frank leaned on his shovel, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Ah, the Queen's tax," he said with a wry smile. "She runs this place like her own little fiefdom." That was my opening. Over the next hour, I laid out the situation, omitting my deeper investigation but focusing on the escalating harassment and the threat to my wife's memorial. Frank listened patiently, his expression growing more serious. "She's a bully, plain and simple," he said when I finished. "She thrives on control. Most folks around here are too scared of her to push back. They just pay the fines and hope she moves on to the next target." He paused, looking me square in the eye. "But this thing with the mineral rights, that's different. That's not just petty tyranny. That's ambition. There's a bigger play there." Frank became my first ally. His legal mind, trained in the unforgiving world of military justice, was a razor. He helped me interpret the finer points of the HOA covenants and state corporate law. He knew the pressure points. Documentation is your sword and your shield, he told me. Record everything. Every letter, every email, every interaction. Date, time, subject. If she talks to you in person, write down a summary of the conversation the moment you get inside. Assume you'll end up in court. Build the case file an overworked judge can't ignore. On his advice, I installed a high-end security system. Not the kind you buy at a big-box store, but a professional-grade setup with discrete, high-resolution cameras covering every inch of my property's exterior. They were small, easy to miss, and recorded crystal-clear audio. The server was in a locked closet in my basement, uploading encrypted backups to a cloud service in real time. If Carol or her husband set one foot on my lawn, I would have it in 4K. The real breakthrough, however, came from my own area of expertise. Frank was right. The mineral rights issue was the key. Her obsession with it was disproportionate. Why did she care so much? It made no sense for an HOA to own mineral rights. They couldn't afford to exploit them, and the liability would be a nightmare. Unless she had reason to believe they were exceptionally valuable. I remembered the HOA had commissioned a geological survey the previous year. The results, presented in a single slide at the annual meeting, had been dismissed as inconclusive, showing minor quartz deposits of no commercial value. I had thought nothing of it at the time. Now, I wondered. I pulled the public records for the survey company. It was a small, local outfit. Too small, perhaps, for a proper subterranean assessment. I decided to do my own. My house had a deep, dry well, dug by my great-grandfather and capped in the 50s. It was the perfect access point. One night, I set up my portable equipment in the privacy of my locked garage. I lowered a gravimeter down the well, a device that measures minute changes in the local gravitational field, hinting at the density of the rock below. Then I used a portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer on soil samples I'd discreetly collected from my own backyard. The data that came back made the hair on my arm stand up. The quartz was there, yes. But that wasn't what was causing the anomalies. The readings showed significant concentrations of something else. Something far rarer. The spectral signature was unmistakable: gallium and germanium. These weren't just minerals. They were strategic elements. Gallium is critical for high-performance semiconductors, the brains in radar systems and missile guidance. Germanium is essential for fiber optics and thermal imaging systems. They were, quite literally, the building blocks of modern military technology. The very materials my company was paid by the Pentagon to find and secure. And there was a significant deposit of them right under Serenity Meadows. Suddenly, Carol's entire scheme snapped into focus, the chaotic data points aligning into a perfect, damning picture. She wasn't just a petty tyrant obsessed with power. She was a criminal mastermind, albeit a clumsy one. Her plan was audacious. She'd found out about the minerals, probably through that survey she commissioned. She was using the HOA as a vehicle to consolidate the mineral rights from all the properties. Her frivolous lawsuit against me was the test case. If she could legally strip the rights from me, the one homeowner with an explicit, ironclad deed, the rest of the neighborhood, whose deeds were silent on the matter, would be easy pickings. Once the HOA controlled all the subsurface rights, she would use her shell company, Meadowlark Holdings, to buy them from the HOA for a pittance. Arthur, her puppet treasurer, would sign off on it. The other board members were either in on it or too clueless to notice. Then, she would be the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar strategic mineral deposit. Her harassment campaign wasn't just spite. It was a calculated strategy to force me out, to make me sell the house and its precious rights to her proxy company. The threat against Eleanor's garden wasn't just cruelty, it was a tactical strike against my emotional foundation, designed to make me fold. I sat in my office, the low hum of my computer the only sound. The cold flame inside me burned brighter. This was so much bigger than I had imagined. This wasn't just about my home anymore. This was about national security. The materials under our feet were vital to the country's defense. Letting them fall into the hands of a greedy, reckless fraud like Carol was unthinkable. My project had a new objective. It wasn't just about stopping her. It was about utterly and completely destroying her network, exposing her fraud, and ensuring she faced the full consequences of her actions. And I knew just how to do it. I was going to use her own greed as the bait in a trap she would never see coming. The foundation of my plan was a principle from my own field, fracture mechanics. To break something strong, you don't need overwhelming force. You just need to find a pre-existing flaw, a microscopic crack, and apply a small, precise amount of pressure. The material's own internal stress does the rest. Carol's flaw was her insatiable greed, amplified by her arrogance. She believed she was smarter than everyone else, especially the quiet, grieving engineer in the old house down the street. I would use that belief to guide her, step by step, into a legal and financial deadfall. The first step was to bait the hook. I needed to convince her that I was on the verge of discovering the true value of the land, and that she needed to act fast before I secured it for myself. I spent a day in my workshop, fabricating my lure. I took a standard geological core sample box. Using some worthless rock cores from a previous, unrelated project, I carefully drilled microholes and injected them with a slurry containing a non-radioactive isotope I sometimes used as a tracer. It was harmless, but its signature would be unmistakable to any advanced analysis. To the naked eye, it just looked like boring gray rock. I then printed a series of professional-looking labels for the box, complete with my company's logo, a fake project number, and a contents description. Sample set 734B, gallium germanium bearing pegmatite. I sealed the box with tamper-evident tape. It looked completely authentic. It was a Trojan horse made of cardboard and lies. The next evening, I orchestrated a bit of theater. I brought the box home from my office, making sure to walk from my car to my front door slowly, in full view of the street, and, I presumed, Carol's watchful eyes. Instead of taking it inside immediately, I got distracted by a phone call. I paced on my porch for 10 minutes, talking animatedly to no one, the box sitting conspicuously on my porch railing. Finally, I went inside, forgetting the box outside. The bait was in the water. My security cameras, positioned perfectly, were rolling. I settled in for the wait. I knew she wouldn't be able to resist. The words gallium germanium on that label would be a siren song to her. She would have to know what I had, what I knew. It took 2 nights. I was starting to think I'd overestimated her impatience when, at 2:17 a.m. on the 3rd night, my system alerted me to motion on the front porch. I watched the live feed, my heart beating a steady, rhythmic drum. A shadowy figure slipped out from behind the bushes. It wasn't Carol. It was her husband, Tom. He moved with the clumsy stealth of an amateur, scurrying to the railing and snatching the box. He didn't take it with him. Instead, he took it to the edge of the camera's view, into the shadows of a large oak tree. I could see him working at the tamper tape with a small knife. He opened the box. He took out his phone, angled it to avoid the flash, and took several pictures of the cores and the internal labels. Then he carefully placed everything back, resealed the box with a tube of superglue he'd brought along, and put it back on the railing. The entire operation took less than 5 minutes. He scurried back across the lawn and disappeared. I had him. I had them both. Trespassing. Attempted theft of what he believed were trade secrets. It was a federal offense. A wave of cold satisfaction washed over me. The first crack had appeared in their foundation. I didn't do anything with the video immediately. That would have been premature. This was just the first piece of leverage. I downloaded the footage, made 3 separate encrypted backups, and stored them in different physical and digital locations. Then I went out, retrieved the box, and brought it inside as if nothing had happened. Phase 2 required a public setting. The monthly HOA meeting was the following week. It was the perfect stage. The meetings were usually dull affairs, attended only by Carol, her board of cronies, and a handful of gadflies. I wanted more people there. I spent the weekend talking to neighbors. I didn't mention my evidence or my grand plan. I just stoked the embers of their own discontent. To a woman who had been fined for her holiday decorations, I said, I'm planning to ask the board to justify their fining policy at the next meeting. It might be good if more people were there to ask questions. To a man who was fighting with them over the color of his mailbox, I said, I think there's a budget issue we need to discuss. The legal fees seem awfully high. By the time the meeting rolled around, the community room was fuller than it had been in years. There was a buzz in the air, a sense of collective frustration that had finally found a voice. Carol was in her element, presiding from a folding table at the front of the room, flanked by her treasurer, a nervous, bird-like man named Arthur, and a stone-faced woman who was the secretary. She loved an audience. She ran through the agenda with smug efficiency, shutting down any questions with a curt, "That's not on the agenda for tonight." Then she got to old business. She looked directly at me, a thin, predatory smile on her face. "And finally, the ongoing issue of the unceded mineral rights at Lot 72, she said, using my property's official designation. "Our attorneys have filed the initial suit to clear the title. We expect a swift and favorable judgment that will affirm the association's ownership of these vital community assets." This was my cue. I stood up. "A question for the board, if I may," I said, my voice calm and even. Carol's eyes narrowed. "This has been turned over to our legal counsel. We can't comment on active litigation." "My question isn't about the litigation," I said, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat. "It's a security question. A matter of criminal activity." That got everyone's attention. People shifted in their plastic chairs. I looked directly at Carol. Her smile was gone, replaced by a mask of wary indignation. "Carol," I asked, my voice projecting to every corner of the room, "has anyone associated with you, or acting on your behalf, recently committed a felony by trespassing onto private property to illegally obtain what they believe to be proprietary geological data?" The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Carol's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Confusion, then a flicker of recognition, then pure, unadulterated rage. Her skin flushed a deep, blotchy red. She looked like a pressure cooker reaching critical failure. "How dare you!" she shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. The water bottle in front of her jumped. "That is an outrageous and defamatory accusation. You are a paranoid, delusional man who is trying to bully this community." She was a terrible liar. Her over-the-top reaction was a confession in itself. I saw Arthur, the treasurer, shrink in his seat, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Several neighbors exchanged troubled glances. They had seen Carol be a bully, but this was different. This was hysteria. "It was a simple yes or no question," I said quietly, holding her gaze. "This meeting is over," she yelled, banging a small gavel on the table. "Get out. All of you." People filed out, murmuring amongst themselves. The seed of doubt had been planted. Her credibility, her most valuable asset, had just sustained a significant fracture. She had lost control, and in her world, loss of control was death. I knew what would come next. I had wounded her, and a wounded predator is the most dangerous. She would retaliate, not with fines and letters, but with something designed to cripple me. I went home and prepared for the coming storm. It was exactly what my plan required. The retaliation came faster and with more venom than even I had anticipated. Carol was no longer playing a game of attrition. She was trying to deliver a kill shot. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, I received a call from the head of security at my company. His name was Peterson, a grim ex-Marine who viewed the world through a lens of threat assessment. His tone was flat, devoid of its usual professional courtesy. "We need you to come in," he said. "Now. And don't bring any personal electronics with you." I knew immediately what this was. When you have a high-level security clearance and work on sensitive defense contracts, a summons like that means only one thing: your clearance is under review. It's the professional equivalent of a heart attack. When I arrived, I was escorted not to my office, but to a windowless conference room. Peterson was there, along with 2 people from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. They didn't shake my hand. "We've received an anonymous tip," one of the agents began, his voice a monotone. "The allegation is that you have been attempting to privately exploit strategic mineral resources on your property for personal gain, and have made inquiries to sell this data to foreign entities." My blood ran cold. This was her move. She was using the evidence her husband had stolen, the pictures of my decoy core samples, and twisting it into an accusation of espionage. She wasn't just trying to get me fired, she was trying to put me in a federal prison. It was a vicious, scorched-earth attack that threatened to destroy my career, my reputation, and my freedom. I stayed calm. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. That allegation is categorically false, I said, my voice steady. The next 8 hours were a grueling interrogation. They went through my entire life, my finances, my travel, my communications. They wanted to know about the core samples, the labels, everything. This was the moment my meticulous planning paid off. I didn't get defensive. I didn't get angry. I simply laid out the facts. This is not an act of espionage, I explained. It is part of a documented, systematic campaign of harassment against me by the president of my homeowners association, a woman named Carol. I told them the whole story, starting with the first letter and ending with the staged incident on my porch. I explained that the core samples were a deliberate fabrication, a decoy designed to bait an adversary. I gave them the names of my attorney and my neighbor, Frank, as character witnesses. Crucially, I told them I had video evidence of the entire event. The box was planted, I concluded. The data on the labels was fake. The entire event was a trap to catch the people who have been harassing me for months. The anonymous tip you received is their desperate, malicious retaliation. The agents listened, their faces unreadable. When I was done, they took my statement and told me I was on administrative leave, with my clearance suspended, pending a full investigation. I was to have no contact with my office or any government materials. I was escorted from the building like a criminal. Driving home, the enormity of what she had done truly sank in. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had weaponized the very national security apparatus I worked to support and turned it against me. My anger was no longer a flame, it was a block of ice in my gut. But as I sat in my silent house, a new feeling began to emerge, anticipation. She thought she had cornered me. She thought she had delivered the final blow. What she didn't realize was that she had just handed me the sledgehammer I needed to bring her entire world crashing down. By involving the Department of Defense, she had escalated this conflict into a federal arena, where the rules were different and the consequences were severe. The investigation was swift and thorough. The agents were professionals. They pulled my security camera footage. They analyzed the stolen data and confirmed the minerals were just worthless rock laced with a harmless tracer isotope. They interviewed Frank, who gave them a damning account of Carol's reign of terror. While the feds were doing their work, something remarkable happened. The whistleblower I had hoped for, but never counted on, appeared. It was Arthur, the nebbish HOA treasurer. He showed up at my door one evening, looking terrified. He was clutching a manila envelope, his hands trembling. "I can't do this anymore," he stammered, avoiding my eyes. "She's crazy. This has gone too far." He came inside and laid it all out. He confirmed my entire theory. He told me about the first geological survey, the one from her brother-in-law's firm, that had positively identified the gallium and germanium deposit. He said Carol had buried that report and forced him to authorize payment for a second, SHEM survey from a different company, the one that reported only worthless quartz. He had copies. The original invoice, the buried report with its damning mineral analysis, and the falsified HOA financial statements she'd made him prepare to hide the first payment. It was a complete record of her conspiracy. "She told me if I ever said anything, she'd ruin me," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "But when I heard what she did to you, calling the feds, I couldn't be a part of it. That's not just HOA nonsense. That's evil." I now held the final, undeniable proof. The smoking gun wasn't just a gun, it was an entire arsenal. Wire fraud, conspiracy, filing a false report with a federal agency. These weren't civil infractions. These were felonies. 2 days later, I was called back to the DCSA office. The atmosphere was completely different. They offered me coffee. Peterson was there, and he actually looked apologetic. "Your clearance has been fully reinstated," the lead agent said. "We have concluded that the tip against you was malicious and without merit. We apologize for the inconvenience." "It was more than an inconvenience," I said, my voice hard. "It was an attempt to destroy my life." "We agree," the agent said. "And we are not the only ones," he slid a business card across the table. It was for a special agent in the FBI's white-collar crime division. Filing a false report regarding a matter of national security is a serious federal offense. They are very interested in your story. And in this, he pushed a file across the table. It contained Arthur's documents. They had already been to see him. The trap was no longer just mine. It now belonged to the United States government. And it was about to spring shut. The final act needed a grand stage. A courtroom would have been effective, but I wanted something more personal, more poetic. I wanted Carol's downfall to happen in the very place where she had built her power, the community she terrorized. Working with the FBI and a very motivated assistant United States attorney, we devised the plan. I would use the HOA's own bylaws against her. I collected signatures from over a third of the homeowners, an easy task, now that people knew what she'd tried to do to me, to call for a special meeting of the association. The stated purpose on the official notice was simple: to discuss a proposed resolution to the ongoing mineral rights dispute and to review the association's recent legal and geological expenditures. Carol couldn't refuse. It was in the bylaws. She must have seen it as her final triumph, a chance to publicly humiliate me and cement her victory. She probably thought my resolution was some pathetic offer of surrender. To ensure a large audience, and to add a layer of pressure, I tipped off a reporter from a local news station who had a reputation for investigative journalism. I told him there was a story of massive fraud and corruption brewing in a quiet suburban HOA. He was intrigued. The night of the meeting, the community room was packed. It was standing room only. The news camera was set up discreetly in the back. Carol and her husband Tom sat at the head table, looking smug and triumphant. She was practically glowing with self-satisfaction. She saw a room full of her subjects, gathered to witness her coronation. She had no idea she was attending her own execution. 2 men and a woman I didn't recognize were sitting in the front row. They looked like any other suburban couple, dressed in casual clothes. They were FBI agents. The meeting began. Carol gave a gloating preamble about the importance of protecting community assets. Then she turned the floor over to me. "Mr. Miller," she said, dripping with condescension, "has requested this meeting to propose his resolution. The floor is yours." I walked to the podium we had set up. I had a laptop connected to a projector. I took a deep breath. Showtime. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm and clear. "Thank you all for coming. I am here to discuss the mineral rights. But more than that, I am here to talk about the truth." I started from the beginning. The first letter. The escalating fines. The threats against my wife's memorial garden. With each point, I projected a document onto the screen behind me: the letter, the violation notices, the photos of the garden. I was building the narrative, brick by brick. Then, I moved to the core sample box. Carol and the board have accused me of seeking to exploit these minerals for my own gain. They even filed a report to that effect with federal authorities. I paused, letting that sink in. They based this accusation on evidence they obtained illegally. I played the video. The room was utterly silent as the grainy, night vision footage filled the screen. There was Tom, her husband, scurrying onto my porch like a rat. There he was, prying open the box, photographing the contents. There was no denying it. A collective gasp went through the audience. Tom's face went white as a sheet. Carol stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. That's doctored," she stammered. "That's fake." "Is it?" I asked calmly. "Forensic experts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation seem to think it's authentic." I clicked to the next slide. It was the budget. "Next, let's talk about money." "Your money," I showed them the official HOA budget, the one they had all seen. Then I clicked again, and a second document appeared beside it. It was the real budget, the one Arthur had given me. "This," I said, pointing to the second document, "is the budget the board didn't want you to see. Note the line item here. A $50,000 payment to V.G. Consulting. That payment was hidden from the official budget you all approved." I clicked again. A copy of the check, front and back, appeared. It was endorsed by Carol's brother-in-law. "And what did the community get for this secret $50,000 payment?" I asked. "We got this." The next slide was the buried geological report. I highlighted the executive summary, which clearly stated the presence of a commercially significant deposit of gallium and germanium. The room erupted in angry murmurs. People were on their feet, shouting questions at the board table. Carol was cornered. Her smugness had evaporated, replaced by the wild, panicked look of a trapped animal. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "So let's put it all together," I said, my voice rising, dominating the room. "Carol discovers there are millions of dollars of strategic minerals under our homes. She hires her brother-in-law to write a secret report confirming it. She buries that report and presents a fake one to all of you. She then launches a campaign to have the HOA seize control of all mineral rights, starting with a fraudulent lawsuit against me. When I resist, she and her husband trespass on my property, steal what they think is my data, and use it to file a false report with the FBI, accusing me of espionage, in an attempt to have me imprisoned." I turned from the screen and looked directly at her. This was never about protecting the community. This was about greed. This was a conspiracy to defraud every single one of you, to steal your property from under your feet, and sell it to a shell company owned by her own husband. That's when she completely shattered. "It was my idea," she shrieked, rising from her chair, her face a contorted mask of fury. "Mine. I did all the work. I found it. I deserve it. You all would have just sat here on top of it, fat and stupid. Those rights are mine." It was a full confession, screamed in a room full of witnesses, with a news camera rolling and the FBI listening. On that cue, the 3 agents stood up from the front row. The man in the middle held up his badge. "FBI," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Carol, you and your husband are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and filing false statements to federal law enforcement." As the agents moved toward the table, Tom just slumped in his chair, a broken man. But Carol fought. She flailed as they put the cuffs on her, screaming obscenities. The queen was being dethroned, and she did not go quietly. As they led her past me, her eyes met mine. They were filled with a venomous, bottomless hatred. "You will regret this," she hissed, her voice a raw rasp. "I will destroy you." I just looked at her. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel triumph. I just felt a profound sense of pity. She was a hollow person, consumed by her own greed. Her threats were the last empty gasps of a power that no longer existed. The aftermath was like the calm after a hurricane. The news story exploded, becoming a local sensation. HOA tyrant's multi-million-dollar mineral heist foiled by homeowner. The legal process was swift and brutal. Faced with the mountain of evidence and Arthur's testimony, Carol, Tom, and her brother-in-law took plea deals rather than face a jury. They lost everything. Their house was seized through asset forfeiture. They were ordered to pay massive restitution to the HOA. Carol and Tom both received hefty prison sentences in a federal penitentiary. Her last, impotent threat from that night echoed only in the silence of her prison cell. The community of Serenity Meadows began to heal. The HOA was temporarily put into receivership by the state. Frank, my neighbor, stepped up to lead the charge in forming a new, transparent board. All of Carol's ridiculous fines were voided, and the oppressive atmosphere of judgment and fear lifted like a fog. Neighbors started talking to each other again. Kids played in the street. It started to feel like a community. My life returned to the peace I had originally sought. The federal government, specifically the Department of Defense, was extremely grateful. The gallium and germanium deposit was declared a national strategic mineral reserve. It would not be mined, but it would be protected, shielding the neighborhood from any future disruption. My contract was renewed, and I received a quiet commendation for services to national security. Sometimes, I sit in Eleanor's garden, on the simple stone bench that started it all. The Japanese maple has grown, its leaves a brilliant crimson in the autumn air. The neighborhood is quiet, but it's a different kind of quiet now. It's not the tense silence of oppression, it's the gentle, peaceful quiet of contentment. I never set out to be a hero or a giant killer. I was just a man who wanted to be left alone with his memories. But when a bully tried to tear down the last sanctuary I had, I found that the same skills I used to understand the earth, patience, methodical analysis, and an understanding of pressure and breaking points, could also be used to dismantle a petty tyrant. Justice, I've learned, isn't always about a dramatic courtroom showdown. Sometimes, it's about careful research, meticulous documentation, and setting a trap so perfect that your enemy walks right into it, brought down not by your strength, but by the weight of their own corruption. Carol thought she was digging for treasure, but in the end, the only thing she was really digging was her own grave.